Hello, thanks for joining today's webinar with Real Story Group, one of our favorites of the year, as we walk through the latest iteration of the famous or perhaps infamous MarTech vendor subway map. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with RSG, and we've also got our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, on the line with us as well. Tony will be taking us through the majority of today's presentation and really going to focus on the latest trends in the different marketplaces that we cover, along with the changes that have been made to the map. So that's an exciting one for us, and we're thrilled to show it to you, and along with some other new things that we've been working on over the past few months. So I do want to mention that we will have time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, feedback, anecdotes you'd like to share, please feel free to enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And the slides from today's presentation will be sent out within the next couple of days, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, for our subscribers on the line, this presentation will be available to you in your subscriber library within the next few days. So you can keep an eye on for that and share it with your colleagues who aren't able to attend live today. Just real quick, I do see a lot of new folks on the line today, so I want to give you a quick overview about Real Story Group. We've been at this now for over 24 years, and Tony likes to tell the story of, he really founded RSG out of frustration with your so-called traditional analyst firms, as we are the only firm that we've ever come across that sits exclusively on the buyer side of the table. So our job is to help find the MarTech solutions that are going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So when we're providing you with analysis, either in our research or through our MarTech Stack advisory, we're really going to pull no punches in describing what these vendors do well, but perhaps more importantly, what they don't do well and where they might fall short for you. And our relationship with the vendors is such is that we don't work for them in any way, shape, or form. So we are just focused on helping you make the right solution decisions for your enterprise. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony, who will take us through the rest of today's presentation. Tony?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. Super excited to share with you the latest version, the 2025 version of our MarTech Stack vendor map. So for those of you who haven't seen it before, what we do is take every marketplace and turn it into a subway line, or for those of you in London and elsewhere, kind of a tube map, a different tube line here. So we've got 10 different marketplaces where we cover and evaluate vendors, each one represented by a different colored line on this map. And we've done some significant updates this year, as we do every year. So really excited to explain that to you and help sort of interpret, what's going on in the MarTech world. So we'll start with a couple of things, just, for the point of being real here. We're going to talk about what the map is not, what it doesn't do, but then kind of what it does do and what it does tell us, what's happening overall. And then we're going to do a quick peek into some key markets to sort of talk some trends about what's going on in this world for you, the MarTech buyer. And then we'll finalize with some key takeaways. And as Scott mentioned, we'll definitely have time for your questions. You just have to put them in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Okay. So what is the map not? It's not a stack diagram. So this is not saying that you even need to license all 10 of these technologies. In fact, I don't know of a single customer we work with actually that does have one of these at all 10, but it's really more a story around the possibilities. And it doesn't necessarily, although some vendors cross two lines, in other words, it's a subway station with two lines going through, that doesn't necessarily make that vendor better or worse, or that vendor, offering some kind of a stack strategy. It just means that they have two different offerings. So this is not a stack. We do have a stack reference architecture for the 2020s that we find extremely useful in our work with enterprises like you. This is both describing what's going on and is also kind of an aspirational a roadmap to where we think you should be going. And the key thing about this is this innovation here around enterprise foundation services at the bottom. These are a set of key capabilities that you want to decouple from your engagement services so that you can have them work in a more omni-channel way. And also this means that your engagement services then can become what we describe as legless. In other words, they're not binding you to a particular set of content, data, and logic such that they can incorporate those capabilities from at a more foundational level in your enterprise. We think that is the innovation, the paradigm for the rest of the 2020s. This is kind of a B2C version. There's also a B2B version of this as well. It's not actually structurally all that different. But so if you're interested in a stack, we have a different visual for you, and you can find some other webinars on this in our library. The other super important thing to say here is that not all these vendors are equal. Just because one has two lines going through it doesn't make it a better vendor. It just means that they're selling two different products, or they're claiming that the same product can do two different things. And certainly their proximity to the center or somewhere else doesn't really have any meaning. In other words, they're not making any value judgments with this map. We're just saying that in these marketplaces, these are the most significant vendors, the vendors that we get inquiries on, particularly from larger enterprises, right? So this isn't designed to be completely comprehensive. These are just the ones we think are the most significant, right, in these different marketplaces. But that doesn't mean that they're equal in value. We always say that the best vendor for you is the vendor that best fits your particular requirements. So I'll just give you an example here. As we look at what Scott introduced as a kind of a mystical quadrant, something you might see from a traditional analyst firm like Forrester and Adobe, and let's say they put something out for journey orchestration, you can almost be sure that they're going to have Adobe in the upper right. But we have at Real Story Group, we call our Real Quadrant Generator, where you actually put in and weight the scenarios that are really important to you. So you might see that. It might be a little hard to read, but I'll just point you to the lower right-hand corner where it talks about journey listening, offline orchestration, service and support. Those are the key use cases. And what's interesting about that is that when you do that, then Adobe ends up being kind of in the geek and loser column. It's definitely not one of the winners here. So all this is to say that any one of these vendors could be a good or bad fit for you, depending on what you're trying to do. That seems obvious, but we found that this is actually somewhat of a revelatory concept in the analyst world. Okay, so that's what the map is not. Let's talk about what it is actually telling us here, because I think it's telling us some really interesting things, some things that are persisting and some things that are maybe a little bit different as we go into the second half of this decade. So the first thing that's really pervasive across all these marketplaces is that they are fragmented. So fragmented is analyst speak for there are a hell of a lot of vendors out there in each one of these categories. You'll see in a moment, it has always been that way. And we think it's very likely to persist that way. And what's interesting is that since I started doing this, in 2001, I didn't have gray hair then, but there were people who did have gray hair who would come up to me and say, there's 30 web content management vendors now, there's 25 DAM vendors, whatever, 15 email platform vendors, but don't you worry your little self. In a few more years, they're going to consolidate, and there's only going to be 3 or 4 that are really significant. What's interesting in the MarTech space is that kind of consolidation never, ever happened. So we need to be careful about these sort of annual predictions. Lately, it's been around CDPs. Oh, there's going to be consolidation in the marketplace. All these vendors are going to fail. They're going to go away. Now, to be sure, some vendors do get bought by others and kind of get subsumed within somebody else's stack. Some of them do kind of disappear. For the most part, most of these vendors, particularly now that they're almost all SaaS vendors, they tend to persist. And so in general, we tend to think that that's good for you, the buyer, that you have a lot of choices, that the vast majority of those choices are highly viable. There's no guarantees there, but again, the vast majority of your choices are highly viable suppliers. And choice has been good. Choice has helped bring some of the real costs down. Choice has allowed you to find just the right fit. Choice in general has allowed you to also have what we describe as a composable stack. So this is just a little bit of a history. We've been doing subway maps since 2008. And they've changed a little bit. We've added some technologies over the years, changed the format a little bit. But one thing that has been consistent is that there has always been this, yes, some sort of a city center, but also a kind of this periphery, if you will, of point solution vendors, many of whom are responsible for the significant innovation. So I have a feeling that our 20th anniversary map, which will be in 2028, structurally won't be much different than this, even given some of the interesting things that are happening with AI. So as I mentioned, there is a city center here. There always has been, probably always will be. These are major vendors. Some of the names have changed over the years, but you look at Salesforce, Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, and SAP, still players. Acoustic has the remnants of the IBM stack. There have always been these sorts of players, always will be. Some of them, like Adobe, can boast having capabilities across 9 or 10 of these different marketplaces. Again, that doesn't mean they're the right fit for you. Certainly these vendors definitely brag about the breadth of their capabilities, but that doesn't necessarily make them better. In fact, I think there's some evidence that it often makes them less well-fitting for you. But let's be clear about one thing. Composable stacks have won the day. By composable stacks, I mean having the right fit for the different capabilities that you need and not going with a single vendor across all of them. So at Real Story Group, we have this we call MarTech Leadership Council. This is an enterprise-only peer-to-peer council, MarTech leaders at some major global enterprises. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we've surveyed 30 members of this council and said, what are you using for these different technologies? This is a subset of some of the capabilities that they're using, of some of the vendors that they're using. And in fact, there's even more here that we probably can't totally fit on this slide. And it's really quite striking that, particularly among larger enterprises, the composable model really has won. Now, by composable, I mean the stack is composable. I'm not suggesting that we're decomposing down to the microservice level here, or that we have a so-called composable CDP. I'm saying that across their stack, they're not going with just 1 or 2 vendors. The typical large enterprise has a dozen or more different vendors in key slots across their stack. Okay, so that's what's happening overall. Let's take a little bit of a peek into some interesting markets. We're all interesting at some level, but we're seeing some movement certainly in some markets. So of course, the one that's on everybody's lips and I'm sure is on your mind right now is AI. So this is the 3rd year of our AI for MarTech line. That's the lime green line. Now, what's interesting about this is that we get pushback from nearly every other vendor that says, well, I'm an AI vendor now. Some of it is that their investors and their marketing people have insisted that they describe themselves as an AI vendor. That is true only to the extent that almost every one of the 180 vendors on this map, they're lighting up some AI capabilities. But if we're talking about vendors that really focus exclusively on injecting AI services that particularly have some MarTech application, then there are definitely some specific vendors out there that purport to do this, not just internally within one tool, but potentially across your stack. Of course, the challenge is, to the first point here in the blue box, is that AI is just, these capabilities are just kind of showing up across nearly all your tools. You know this. If you're going to be serious about this, you need to carefully vet those capabilities against your enterprise controls. Hopefully you do have some enterprise controls and guardrails and norms and policies and procedures around how you use these things. And some of the MarTech vendors aren't necessarily going to pass your screen. We've seen that among our own clients where they vet some of these capabilities. Sometimes it's homegrown by the MarTech vendor. Very often it's something that some AI capabilities that they've OEM'd or embedded into their platform. And so you need to be very careful about this. Our argument, though, is that in your long-term strategy is that you should center around AI more as a layer that gives you more control over governance, but also over costs. and also over cohesiveness, that it's part of the stool underneath your legless architecture and not necessarily a series of services that are injected at the engagement level. I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll also acknowledge that agents here could change the game. Of course, I don't like to use the word game changer kind of casually here, especially because agents are still very much hypothetical right now. But agents are definitely going to accelerate some of the existing use cases around AI, and will probably bring some new ones as well. So I can guarantee you that there's going to be a part 2 of this map in the second half of 2025, where we're going to have a different colored line for agents, because interestingly, it's a different set of vendors. I'm sorry if that somehow fries your brain and confuses your mind and makes you unhappy because it's one more thing to think about, but the reality is that agentic services, again, in many cases is going to be an overlay on top of your existing AI capabilities. So we'll have more to talk about that in the coming months. But AI, it's obviously a big deal. We tend to think of it more as disruptive rather than transformational right now, but disruptive it is. And so this is our reference model for AI. And of course, the most important thing are those 6 blue boxes you see on the right around responsible AI. You need to make sure at an enterprise level that you're accounting for all of those considerations. Then having done that, we can group AI into 4 different categories. Let's start with insights AI, decisioning AI, and generative AI. Among those, there's about 16 or 17 different use cases. And we like to group these things in terms of use cases for 2 reasons. First of all, use cases you can align with business success, but secondly, you can evaluate vendors against use cases. So in our AI technology evaluation stream, we actually evaluate the vendors against those 17 use cases, and that makes it much more useful for you to understand what might be a good fit. Then agent AI brings a whole new dimension to this around workflow automation and stack orchestration, and a set of kind of interesting core services that you wouldn't see in more, I hate to say this, traditional AI. And so they are going to accelerate some of these use cases and bring in some new ones for sure. So the key takeaways here are: 1, think about AI with respect to use cases. 2, the smart enterprises are making this a layer in their stack, and so you do need to consider the vendors on that lime green line. But 3, you still have those colored engagement services boxes at the top. In other words, AI is not going to make customer care go away, or loyalty go away, or outbound marketing, or web content management. It's not going to replace any of those platforms. It will accelerate your productivity with respect to those platforms. In some cases, enhance the customer experience if you do it right, but they're not actually going to replace those platforms. And so this is really important to understand, because what's happening with AI is that many organizations are kind of paralyzed around their MarTech decision making. In other words, they're saying, well, with AI, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to replace this. I know this is very outdated, but maybe AI is going to change the game. And we don't think it's necessarily going to change the game. It's going to enhance whatever strategies you already have. So now is not the time necessarily to be paralyzed. One thing you can be doing, though, is thinking about that bottom row of colored boxes, what we call foundational platforms: customer data stores, personalization and orchestration, and omni-channel content. We know from working with savvy enterprises that those sort of foundational platforms are really essential to provide the core raw material that AI and agents need to be effective. So that's some work that you can be doing right now. Okay, let's go from one of the newest marketplaces to arguably the oldest marketplace on our map, which is web content and experience management. Coming up on, I'm going to say, 28 to 29 years old. So this is a very, very established marketplace. And like most older marketplaces, what happens is the vendors end up kind of spreading out on a complexity spectrum, where you have on the far left the most complicated tools, and the far right the simpler ones. What's interesting about web content and experience management, this has been happening for the past couple of years, is how it's really getting compressed. That the difference between mid-range and complex platforms is getting narrower and narrower. You have Adobe out there, kind of the last remaining of the big toolkit vendors, and at a time, by the way, when most of you don't need a toolkit for this. And so this is very interesting that you have a lot of really good choices here And in particular, we would argue a lot of really good legless choices where you can go with a simpler platform that's going to be much better at creating the sort of future experiences than you want, that's going to take direction and data and content in many cases from other platforms. So play more nicely in your stack. So that's really the future of web content and experience management is probably going to be more around these mid-range platforms, to some extent some of the complex platforms that are designed to play nicely in a composable stack. Almost everybody's favorite customer data platforms. This is a lot of our inquiries and project work center around CDPs and customer data more generally. When we started covering this space 7 years ago, we had 2 boxes, and now we're up to 7. In other words, this marketplace is evolving. We put it here on a grid where the y-axis is suites versus independents. In general, we find that enterprise customers are less happy with the suite vendors in this regard. Among the independents, again, you have a lot of choices. There's definitely some evolution. There's been some mergers and acquisitions, not necessarily a roll-up. None of the vendors have gone away per se, but there has been some changes. Some have gotten stronger, some have gotten weaker. There's a lot more to say here. But they have also specialized architecturally, business model, focus. And so that, again, is a really good thing, because the role that the CDP is going to play in your architecture, we have seen probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 different design patterns for that across this space. And so it's kind of different strokes for different folks. And the good news is you have a lot of viable choices here. All right, so sorry. Next up, another older marketplace that, again, you can divide on a complexity spectrum: digital asset management, where you have complex solutions, mid-range, simpler. Couple interesting things about this marketplace. So this is one where every year we're adding more to the subway line. In other words, the barrier to entry to do a relatively decent DAM has gotten relatively low in the past several years. And so here again, that's put a lot of upward pressure on the market. In general, we think that's good. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing more entry into this marketplace is because many organizations do not yet have a DAM. So that's really interesting. I don't know of hardly any organizations that don't yet have a web content management, but we know many enterprises, including some large enterprises, that don't yet have a DAM. So it's interesting, is a lot of our work right now around DAM is literally helping an organization pick their very first DAM. The other kind of DAM selection we do is an organization that has picked one of the simpler tools, which are fine as far as they go, but they now need to upgrade to a more sort of enterprisey DAM with greater ambitions around use across multiple different organizations internally and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about that is, if you look at that complex box, some of those vendors are definitely more complex, but they're not yet ready for the future. And the future, we think, is in more of what we would describe as an omni-channel content platform. So if you look at the likes of Highland Nuxio, Media Beacon, OpenText, those are more kind of legacy DAMs. Even to some extent, Adobe is a legacy DAM. And so while they may be bigger and more complex, they may not be where we think DAM is going. So if we look at where DAM is going, we actually came up with a totally different line on our subway map. This is the red line, which we call omni-channel content platform. So this is a spin-off from the digital asset management space. And you can find more information about this on our website, and definitely some recorded webinars about this. But these are platforms that are asset management, but they're not just media and digital and image asset management. They manage narrative and data as first-class objects, and really can serve as a core kind of reusable object-oriented content store. This is very much a step leap from traditional DAM. We've been watching and kind of predicting this for some time. And what's interesting in the last couple of years is that this has become really a reality, and we've helped several large organizations actually make this happen. Easier said than done, but tremendously valuable. We think this is going to be a really essential precondition to doing generative AI effectively. Again, you've got several vendors on this red line. We're not suggesting that they're all really good or that they can all really meet the omni-channel future, but these are vendors that purport to be able to do that. Okay, I'm glad to see some questions queuing up here. Definitely we'll get to those. But first I want to just wrap up here with some key takeaways. So definitely build a composable stack, at least at the platform level. At the sub-platform level, how much you want to compose, that's a separate issue, but that you definitely want to avoid the big MarTech suite plays with their, I think in many cases, bullshit promises about how they're all going to integrate better. These vendors, by the way, often tend to bully you and your boss in ways that are deeply unpleasant. That's the subject of our Real Story Group's inaugural podcast. It's going to be on vendor bullying and how to defeat it. So you can go to realstorygroup.com/podcasts and listen to that, or find it on your favorite podcast network. So first, build a composable stack. Hopefully that's obvious to everyone on the call. Remember to get many choices. So don't fall in love with a single vendor. The best platform is the best fitting platform. Remain thoughtful about how you bring in AI. So it's fine to test and prototype and experiment, and we're seeing a hell of a lot of that. We're not seeing a lot of that go into scalable production. And if you're going to do that, you really want to have a plan and make sure that the vendors you're using are adhering to your controls. And then the last thing is, I don't have to tell you how turbulent these times are, not just socially, but obviously economically and from a business context. And I think that tends to paralyze people, not just as individuals, but as organizations. And the one thing that we want to stress, having been through these cycles over the years, is paralysis is never a friend to MarTech leaders. So you want to make good decisions during this. You want to be planning for what comes next. The organizations that did that most effectively during the pandemic came out of the pandemic all that much stronger competitively to their peers. So this is really the time when MarTech leadership shines, when you can make effective decisions. Those decisions may be around new acquisitions. Those decisions may be around consolidation. Those decisions are certainly going to be around what's your plan around AI. And at Real Story Group, our mission in life is to help you make better decisions, both for the benefit of the enterprise and for you as a MarTech professional to improve your career. So please feel free to turn to us. We've got 3 different services where we can help you. One is to tune your AI strategy or your MarTech strategy more generally. A number of interesting services around that we can offer you. Second is to help you optimize your stack, particularly if you're expecting maybe more turbulent times. Some of our subscribers subscribe to everything across our stack. And the third offering, as I mentioned, is our Real Story Group Council. So this is 24 firms that meet, their MarTech leaders meet a couple times a year in person in the United States and then in Europe. And also we meet virtually in between. Private sessions where we share lessons learned, what's working, what's not working, definitely worth checking out if your firm qualifies. So I'm gonna just peruse the questions that are flowed in here, and then I'll just turn it over to a minute. While I do that, my colleague Scott will tell you about next steps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. Reach out to us directly if you'd like to learn more about that council. We are meeting again next week in Atlanta, so very excited to get back together in person, and we'll have another virtual session coming up in July that you'll be happy to tell you more about. Also, in terms of next steps for webinars, we have another presentation coming up in a couple of weeks about 10 mistakes to avoid when selecting MarTech. So that'll be at this same time on May 14th. Hope to see you then. And in the meantime, here are a few of the questions that have come in, Tony.
Yeah, sure. And if there's more, feel free to put them. So Michael's asking, what are your thoughts on journey management AI agents eventually replacing marketing automation tools? So it's a great question. I think that it depends on what you mean by marketing automation tools. Certainly marketing automation tools that are sort of the Swiss Army knife that can do a lot of different things. Some of those capabilities can and should reside in other places, right? And so what the what the journey management and some AI agents are going to do is replace some of the decisioning subsystems in those tools, but you'll still need something, for example, to actually issue the email, to issue the SMS. You're going to need some sort of composition framework to manage all the different content components that are going to go into those messages. So the traditional ESPs that are out there, I do tend to think that the logic, the data, and the content is going to come from lower levels, and that in the long term, everybody's going to be using programmatic senders for that. But that's still probably, Michael, about 3 to 5 years away. So I think Alexander has a couple questions on the WCM. You list some vendors that are not on the vendor map anymore, and some have been merged. Yeah, so that's true. On that slide, that's a good call out, Alexander. On that slide, we probably have some that have since dropped off that are still supported, but maybe you wouldn't want to buy new. So I think we probably need to update our logo chart. So thanks for that. The other thing that Alexander's pointing out is that there are fewer open source platforms on the map. So this is what's interesting about open source. You know, Alexander, we used to actually have a separate category for open source, and then we realized that actually it's not necessarily a defining feature anymore of something. Is that, you know, open source is just a license model. And what really matters in a lot of ways is what kind of a community there is around that platform, particularly user community. Can you find people like you? And is there an effective developer mix? And so that, you know, cuts both ways with open source. Certainly we still have Drupal on there. You know, Plone is still active. There's some others, but it's less and less of a decider, we find, as an actual, you know, like selection attribute. Amy's asking a really good question. How do you decide whether a DAM is complex, mid-range, or simpler? And she would like to challenge us on that. And so, hey, thank you for the challenge. We'll definitely pass that on to Jared Gingras, who's our DAM expert, and you can see some DAM webinars here. I think it mostly has to do with, you know, the number of users and I would say the number of users, the volume of content, but in particular, you know, the breadth and depth of capabilities. And by the way, when we're saying simpler to complex, these are not value judgments. So I want to be really clear about that. In fact, most enterprises end up overbuying this technology. In other words, buying something that's more complex than they need. Let's see. David is asking, I was a bit late to the call. You may have mentioned it. What do you mean by legless? Yeah, David, really good point. I breezed by that a little bit. So you've probably heard of headless, which is decoupling the actual delivery environment from the engagement platforms underneath it, so that you can not have to have your engagement platform kind of deciding what the customer experience is going to be. So headless WCM, for example, headless CMS is the most known for that. Legless takes that a different step and says, look, if I'm an engagement service like a CRM platform, you know, Salesforce automation platform, I'm an email platform, I'm a web content management system, I'm an e-commerce system, I'm not going to store my own customer data. I'm not going to manage my own enterprise reusable content. I'm not going to be the holder of personalization logic, because all of that should be set at a more omni-channel base level in the enterprise so that there can be a more coherent customer experience. And so to that extent, I'm giving up my legs and relying on the stools underneath. And the three legs of that stool we call our data, data and content, content, data, and decisioning. So those are the three stools of the legs, as it were, the three legs of the stool. And a legless system is a lighter weight, more modern platform that can take orders from those systems. Okay, Manuel, thanks for also pointing out that on the logo chart we have a kind of a legacy vendor there as well. We're going to fix that on our logo chart. So love having all you eagle eyes on here. We try to hold vendors accountable. Love it that you're holding us accountable on this. But in any case, wonderful to spend time with you all. We're going to have some more webinars coming up in the next month on those of you who license Sitecore, what do you do going forward with that platform that's going to bite the dust at some point. And we'll have more to say about DAM and OCP. We'll have a lot more to say about AI and agents. So stay in touch. And if there's any way that we can help you make better MarTech decisions in this somewhat turbulent times, feel free to reach out. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne saying bye for now. So long.